That is Mr. Brown's brilliant slogan for his economic policy. Prudence for a purpose. Prudence is the budget, the use of money, the inputs, and purpose is what it's about, the outcomes. By that standard, by the standard of purpose, New Labour in government is a failure. The purpose was, inspired by values of social justice, to break with the Thatcherite legacy of reckless inequality. But under New Labour, Britain, far from becoming more equal, became a more unequal society. More unequal economically in the distribution of income, and more unequal socially, for example, in health inequalities. The economic consequences of Mr. Brown are negligible, not much for the good, not much for the bad, just nothing. However, this is only the trivial part of my story here this evening. What I'm really here to talk about is why. And that will shift my attention very quickly from questions of this or that government to questions of the Constitution. In my study, I've looked at 4 core policies: child poverty, healthcare, crime, education, and then overall inequality. The assessment is on the government's own terms, prudence for a purpose. I've used the best available independent research and evidence, and I've looked mainly at the good years, from 1997 to 2007. So inputs then. The story is very good. Mr. Brown, as Chancellor, was a master of the budget. More money was put into priority policy areas. More public investment. Public investments went up. And new policy instruments were put to use. But then again, nothing or next to nothing follows through to results in outcomes. Let me say a few things about child poverty, Mr. Brown's flagship policy. This is a picture of what happened. That is the percentage of children living in households in poverty. Now, what that picture basically shows is nothing. Basically nothing. It remains that about a third of children in Britain live in poverty. Now, there are some small movements up and down on that chart, but basically this picture shows nothing. Of the small movements, what happened was that a long upwards trend in the rate of child poverty came to an end in 1994, 3 years before New Labour came to power. Then the rate started to edge downwards, and that's when New Labour came in. And then, after Mr. Brown introduced tax credits, the new instrument to combat child poverty, the rates of child poverty again increased. They should, of course, have decreased, but they increased. And the reason for that was that underlying income inequality then shifted towards increasing inequality, and the policies that were in place were not capable of protecting children against the fallout from increasing underlying inequality. That was exactly the story during the 1980s. Children were not protected, and they are still not protected. In crime, after the new money was put in, a long trend of falling rates of crime was interrupted, and the level of crime stabilized. Only in education is there some success. Here, long-term trends of improvements in educational results were maintained and not interrupted or lost. Now, that's not much of a success, but at least it's not outright failure. It was at poor value for money. Here also productivity declined. And again, inequalities persisted. All in all then, in individual policies, nothing or next to nothing follows through and in the overall purpose of breaking the back of inequality and introducing a melody of social justice, nothing, absolutely nothing. So the question then is why? And the answer to that is extremely difficult and paradoxical, because this was a government that should have succeeded. It had everything. It had power, it had money to work with from economic growth, it had mandate, it had vision, it had ambition, it had activism, it had sincerity, everything. And it was a competent government. There is here a real tragedy in the Greek meaning. The gods gave the ladies and gentlemen of the new Labour government everything they could want and dream of and ask for. And then the gods denied them any benefit from that gift. Now, Mr. Brown and Mr. Cameron shout at each other in Parliament. One saying, "We have succeeded," and the other saying, "You are incompetent." They are both wrong. The story of New Labour is not a story of a government that failed because of incompetence. It is an intriguing story of a government that failed in spite of competence. Now, partly, the government made bad decisions. On child poverty, they used the wrong instruments and they did not put enough money in. They were warned early. In the NHS, much too much money was put in much too quickly and with much too much political spin. On health and crime, preventive policies were neglected and everything was invested in reactive and controlling measures. So there were policy mistakes, and there is much to learn from them. But even that is not much of an explanation, because we have to ask, why did a competent government mess it up for itself with bad decisions? And the deeper explanation then lies in the system of governance and in the Constitution. Now, in looking into government policies in detail, as I've done here, it quickly becomes visible how extremely centralized the British system of government now is. Everything is decided in and run from Downing Street. The rest of the country, and that includes Parliament, is on the receiving end, more under command than in partnership. Now, the absence of mobilizing policies in this review is legion. The population was not mobilized politically to rid the nation of the shame of child poverty and to repay its debt to its children. The professions in healthcare and schools were not rallied and encouraged. Neighborhoods were not mobilized against the scourge of antisocial behavior. People were not mobilized to take care of their health. The government commanded, and everyone else was controlled. New Labour, for all its showmanship and spin, neglected the art of leadership, in particular inside the vast apparatus of government. During the last 30 years or so, the British Constitution has been drastically reshaped. Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown inherited Mrs. Thatcher's centralization. Had they broken with that legacy, they may have succeeded. Instead, they slipped into continuing it and, inadvertently perhaps, undermined their own cause and condemned themselves to ever more effort for ever less gain. If New Labour, with all the gods gave them in 1997, could not rule, then no government in this country can. Let me therefore conclude this evening by offering you Professor Ringen's agenda for constitutional reform. First, restore the House of Commons as the central political authority in British democracy. Second, reinvent local democracy. And it needs to be reinvented. As it is, Britain just does not have proper local units to devolve power to. And third, straighten out political funding and the way we pay for politics. My recipe is the following. Make all political funding public. Ban all donations from individuals, businesses, and unions, and distribute public money as vouchers to voters for them to give to their party of choice or to throw away. Ladies and gentlemen, last week in Washington, President Obama reminded Congress of their duty to get done what we were sent here to do. Here in Britain today, the Constitution is now such that no government can get done what it is sent here to do.